Welcome to the Unconditionally Worthy Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Adia Gooden, a licensed clinical psychologist who believes deeply that you are worthy unconditionally. Hello, and welcome to episode 27 of the Unconditionally Worthy Podcast. So we are heading into the holiday season, at least in the United States. Getting ready for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And, most of us spend more time with family during the holidays. And so I thought that it would be helpful to talk about how our families, and specifically our relationships with our parents, our primary caregivers, influence our self-worth, right? It's not something I've talked about a lot, but I think it's really important, especially as we're moving into a time where you may be spending more time with your parents, with your primary caregivers. And often there are dynamics in those relationships that can be challenging, that can feel very sensitive and tender, especially as they relate to our feelings of worthiness. And so exploring how the parenting we received, the families we grew up in, the dynamics there, how that influenced or influences our sense of worthiness can be really helpful. And I'm also going to share some strategies for taking care of yourself during this time that I also think will be helpful. So let's get into the show. So I'm going to start by talking about my own experience and my own story and experience with my parents specifically. So, in general, I grew up in a calm and happy household, right? My parents are both clinical psychologists. They have a healthy marriage. They rarely argue, at least not in front of me. There were never any huge blowout arguments. There was never any abuse. There was nothing that would be called traumatic happening in my household. And, we were upper middle class family. Both of my parents had good jobs and I went to private schools my whole life. And so, they were able to afford that. They had the resources and the time to find schools that were great fits for me. And so, my life was really comfortable and really good in a lot of ways. And, I got to do extracurricular activities. All of these things were good and positive. And even though there were so many things that were wonderful about my life and my childhood, there were still some things on an emotional level that I wasn't getting. And, I didn't really know what was wrong or why I felt sad and lonely as a kid. But as I look back at it now, and this is, after years of doing therapy and my own personal growth and reflection, I can see what was missing for me. And so I grew up as an only child and I was lonely a lot as a kid. And I used to sort of blame that loneliness all on the fact that I was an only child. And I think, to some extent that was true, right? I didn't have siblings that I grew up with that I could play with, that sort of thing. But I also think that there are plenty of only children who grow up in families where there's a lot of closeness and a lot of connection, and they don't experience the same loneliness that I experienced. And I think that one of the sources of my loneliness was the fact that both of my parents, kind of operate with a little bit of an emotional distance, right? There is some distance, some separation emotionally between me and them. Our family is connected, but it's not super close, warm and fuzzy, right? So, to give you an example right now, I talk to my dad probably once a month on the phone. And I talk to my mom on the phone probably once every 2 weeks. And my mom will text me sort of intermittently, just very light, like very light checking in, every maybe once a week or every few days. Right. And so there isn't a lot of communication, right? There isn't a lot of, we're talking every day, we're talking every week, we're, keeping in touch, right? That is sort of the dynamic. And I think that there were elements of that when I was growing up. And now it feels okay for me. I'm used to it. I remember there were periods of time when I would feel envious of my friends who talk to their moms every day and who were like, my mom is my best friend and we talk all the time. And, I think there's, probably advantages and disadvantages to those dynamics, but that really was just never how I was with my parents or how my parents were with me. I think one of the things that contributed to my feelings of loneliness and some of the distance that I experienced as a kid was that I'm an extrovert. So I like to spend most of my time with other people. I like to talk. I like to be connected. I like to spend quality time with people. And both of my parents are introverts, right? So they really value their alone time. And, my parents did not parent me in the way that I think a lot of people parent now, which is sort of the child is the center of the family and the center of the family's world. I got to do a lot of things, but life in our household was not centered around me. And I think there's a lot of value to that, right? It's something that when I have kids, I'd like to, practice. I don't want every vacation to be going to Disneyland, right? And even if we do that sometimes, right, there's going to be some adult things that happen. But I think that I often felt like, my parents were together and then there was me, right? It often sort of felt that way to me. It was like my parents and then me, right? And it was very clear that I was separate from their marriage. And it felt like a separation, right? It didn't feel so much like we were like a family unit that was super close. It felt like they had each other and then I was a little bit on my own. And, I say that not to say that I was neglected. I wasn't neglected by any stretch of the imagination, right? I really didn't experience neglect, but I think what happened was that my parents were pretty hands off, right? They are both very independent people. They don't ask for help a lot. And that sort of dynamic was passed down for me. And so I didn't ask for help. I didn't ask for help on my homework. Parents didn't really offer to help. We didn't have the big, uncomfortable, messy talks about sex and dating. I don't even think I talked to them that much about what was going on with my friendships and me feeling left out. And so there were a lot of ways in which I felt like I was left to navigate the emotional ups and downs of my childhood and teenage years on my own, right? And again, my parents weren't neglectful, but they were sort of hands off. They were sort of, you'll figure it out, right? And I think that if anything had gone really wrong, they would have stepped in, but it didn't because of the type of kid I was, right? I was sort of anxious. I was high achieving. I was type A. I was perfectionistic. And so there wasn't, nothing went terribly wrong so that they needed to intervene, which meant that I was sort of left to my own devices in a lot of ways. And, this impacted my self-worth, right? I think, my parents didn't intend for that to happen, but I needed more support and encouragement and closeness than they provided. And there's different ways that kids sort of respond to not getting their needs met. And as psychologists and mental health professionals, we sort of kind of group these responses in two main categories. It is imperfect because kids can experience and engage in behaviors in both categories, but it's sort of an imperfect way to understand how kids tend to respond. So we like to say that there are internalizers and there are externalizers. And externalizers are the kids who act out in response to things they don't like, right? So they're not getting their needs met. There are rules that don't fit for them. They're being asked to do something that doesn't feel fair or doesn't feel right. They need more support. And they respond by arguing, by throwing tantrums, by engaging in aggressive behavior. Like what we say is they act out, right? So they push back against the people setting the rules. They, push the boundaries. They do things that communicate externally that something is wrong, that they are not happy. Often these kids get punished, right? Instead of being understood and somebody saying, okay, what do you need, right? What are you communicating that you need? These kids often get punished, right? And they get labeled as bad kids or something's wrong with them, right? So instead of the adults in their lives slowing down to say, hey, what's going on? What do you need? What's wrong? They're labeled as bad and they're punished, right? So these kids, that's often what happens to kids who tend to externalize, right? And so if that was you, right, you might just check in with yourself and notice what that was like, because that certainly can impact your sense of self-worth, right? If you're being labeled as bad or wrong, if you're being punished through trying to communicate that something is wrong with you or that you need support, that's really going to affect how you see yourself. And it's going to impact your sense of, am I good enough? Am I worthy? Am I lovable? Etc. So then the other category is internalizers. And internalizers tend to turn their concerns inward, right? Feel anxious, self-critical, blame themselves, try to be perfect, feel depressed, feel down on themselves, right? They turn their frustration, their disappointment, all of the things, all of the feelings that are coming up from not feeling good enough, they turn it inward onto themselves, right? And I was an internalizer, right? So I didn't act out. I didn't make a scene. I didn't make things difficult, right? But I internalized and I said, something's wrong with me, right? I said, I must be lonely because I'm unlovable. I said, I just must not be worthy as I am. I have to be perfect. Right. And so that's how I responded to, both the challenges that I was having socially at school and not getting some of the emotional support and closeness that I really needed from my parents. And what happens with internalizers, the kids who internalize, is that they often are overlooked because they're not causing problems, right? They're the kids who are sitting anxiously and they're often doing well in school, right? Because they're so anxious, they're overworking. So they also don't get the support that they need because people on the outside, people think, oh, that child is fine, right? They're not upset. They're not acting out. There's no issues. Like they're getting their homework done. They're doing what they're supposed to do, right? Like this child is fine, right? And so that also happens, right? And so for me, I, really internalized my loneliness. I thought I didn't realize when I was a kid that part of the reason I was lonely is because my parents were somewhat emotionally distant. I didn't realize that. I just thought there was something wrong with me. I just thought that I was unlovable, right? I just had the sense that I should probably be different. And I tried to make myself different. I saw my parents as being perfect and I strived to be the same, right? I criticized and judged myself and I tried to be perfect. And, part of this was emphasized by the fact that everyone loved my parents, like everyone at our church, all of their colleagues, all of my friends, everyone loved my parents. And so I would have this experience of feeling like my parents were great and also like I wasn't getting everything I needed. Like there was some distance, like there was some criticism sometimes, but that feeling, my experience with them was sort of overridden by hearing people, in our community say, oh, your parents are amazing. They are so wonderful. They are the best, right? So the way my parents showed up was that people just loved them. And so for me as a kid to feel like my parents, didn't totally love me or they weren't as supportive and close and connected as I wanted them to. So for me, it was like, okay, well, yeah, the problem must be me. Everybody else loves them, right? Everybody else seems to be getting from them what they want. And so if I'm not, then it must be me, right? That's how I interpreted that. That's how I made sense of what was going on. And, that was hard, right? And I think it's interesting because I have so much more clarity on this dynamic now, right? There are things that my parents continue to do or not do that because I'm an adult, because I have done so much work on embracing my unconditional self-worth, because I'm in a healthy romantic relationship, a healthy marriage, that I'm able to see, oh, that's kind of weird, right? Like, it's kind of weird that you wouldn't call me when, or it's kind of weird that I don't hear from you, right? Like, I can see it now. But as a kid, and this is often what happens with kids, you just think it's my fault, right? This is why so many kids blame themselves for the trauma, for the abuse that they experience, for a parent leaving or abandoning them, for, their parents divorcing, right? As kids, we tend to understand things as our fault. And it's incredibly painful and incredibly difficult. So, I'm not sharing all of this to paint my parents as bad people or bad parents, because I don't think they're either, right? I think they're great people. And I think in a lot of ways, they were really wonderful parents. But I do think it's important for me to share my story with you, because I think that I'm guessing that some of you can relate. I'm guessing that there's some of you who may have had sort of generally happy, positive childhoods, but came through it still feeling like something was wrong with you and still feeling unworthy, and you're confused, right? Like, how did this happen, right? How did this happen if I generally had a happy childhood, right? I think there are others of you who may be listening who experienced incredible trauma in your childhood. And that can be a clear signal of why it's been difficult to connect to or embrace your unconditional self-worth, because somebody who was responsible for caring for you may have harmed you significantly, right? And so I share this because I do think it's important to recognize how our parents impact us. And this isn't about blaming them. This isn't about saying, oh, they're awful people, they're horrible, right? It's about acknowledging that sometimes, maybe often, despite their best efforts, our parents are not able to give us everything we need. Our parents do not have the emotional capacity to give us everything that we need. And most of the times, that's because they didn't get some of the things that they needed when they were growing up. And I talk a lot with my clients about how to hold the fact that their parents may have tried their best and they may still have not received some of the things that they desperately needed or desperately wanted from their parents. And that is sort of this nuanced place to be in, right? Most of us grew up with parents who had some limitations in some ways, right? Who were not perfect. Most of us did not have perfect parents because they're human, right? And so I really encourage people to avoid either blaming themselves for what they didn't get that they needed, right? Like, that's what I did for the first half, more than the first half of my life, or totally blaming their parents, right? And sometimes what happens is you go from blaming yourself to totally blaming your parents, and then you end up in this more nuanced place. And that's often what I'm helping people do in therapy, right? Is sort of hold both truths, hold the truth that they didn't get everything they needed and the truth that their parents may have done the best they could given what they knew and what they were able to do. And one of the things that really helps with this is contextualizing the experiences of your parents, right? So your parents didn't grow up in a vacuum, right? They had their own experiences with their parents, with their caregivers. And so one of the things that helps me is knowing that, my dad had a challenging childhood, right? He's from Jamaica. His mother died when he was 4 years old in a hurricane. His father left shortly after that to go to graduate school. So then he was with some church members who were abusive. And then he was with his grandparents who were very supportive. And then he was in boarding school. And then he came to the US and went to college and didn't go home for 4 years because he couldn't afford it. Right. So understanding, my dad's journey, and those are the outlines of it, but that he didn't always get the care and nurturance that he needed. And that at a very, very, very young age, he lost his mom. He lost a primary caregiver. And so that is going to impact his ability to be close to me, right? That's going to affect things, right? And so when I understand my dad in that context, it helps me to be forgiving. It helps me to be understanding. It helps me not to blame myself and also not to blame him, and to understand, okay, he did the best he could with what he knew, right? And same with my mom, right? My mom had a mom who was very warm, very fuzzy. I loved my grandmother. I feel like she's the person who loved me the most in the world. She was so warm, so fuzzy. And, my mom, that wasn't the style of parenting that worked best for her, especially as she got older. And my mom was closer to her father, who passed away when she was in her late 20s, early 30s. So before I was born. Right. And so first of all, she had a parent whose parenting style didn't align with what fit for her. And then she also had a parent who she was very close to, who she lost. Right. And so that, I believe, set the stage for how my mom mothered me. And so understanding the context of our parents' journeys can really help us to be forgiving, to not invalidate our own experience, but not feel stuck in, why didn't you do what I needed you to do kind of place, which, it's fine to feel angry and upset, but if you're stuck there, it can really be unhelpful. And so, this holiday season, if you're spending more time with your family, it might really be a great opportunity to explore, like, what was your parents' life like growing up, right? What did they experience? What kind of parenting did they have? Right? To try to put together the pieces of how they became who they are, how they became the parent they are, and what limitations they developed based on their experience. So what I want to leave you with today is a suggestion for how you can attend to the little one in you who didn't get everything they needed. And, I'm going to call this reparenting ourselves, right? So one of the most powerful healing practices we can engage in, right, as we want to heal developmental wounds or traumas, is offering ourselves the love, the compassion, the care, the protection, the understanding that we needed from our parents or our primary caregivers, but didn't receive. And often, if you feel triggered or upset, right, if something sort of takes over because you're so upset and you're like, why am I responding in this big of a way because this small thing, seemingly small thing, it's usually because your younger self, who needed comfort and care at a difficult time, didn't get it. And your younger self is crying out for support and attention. And what we don't want to do in those moments is criticize ourselves and say, what's wrong with me? I shouldn't be reacting. Like, that's not a big deal, right? Because that's probably doing the same thing that was done to us, which is not helpful. What we do want to do in those moments is imagine offering our younger self the love, the care, the support, the compassion that our younger selves need, that we needed back then. Right. And that could look like comforting yourself by giving yourself a hug, imagining giving your younger self a hug, having them lay their head on your shoulder. Can mean encouraging them by letting them know you're there for them. You're not going to leave them. Could mean offering empathy and saying you understand how they feel. You want to think about what you needed and wanted in those moments? What care, what love, what concern, what support did you need and want at that time? And how do you give that to yourself now? Every time you do it, every time you practice this, you are healing the wounds from your childhood. You are healing your younger self. You are giving yourself the love and the comfort, the parenting that you didn't get, right? And that is healing and that is powerful. And so I want to leave you with that practice because, we can't control our parents and we can't choose our parents, right? And it can feel sort of disempowering to be like, okay, well, my parents are who they are. Like, they're not going to change. And so what am I going to do about it, right? But to say that, you can build a different relationship with your parents as an adult, and you can offer yourself the love, the kindness, the compassion, the care that you needed, right? You can give that to yourself now. And it's really powerful. It may feel a little bit silly, but I promise you it will help. And so you can fill in the gaps from what you didn't have now. And I really encourage you to do that, especially if you have a particularly tender relationship with a parent. If you have a relationship, what I mean by tender in this moment is sort of one that's very sensitive, right? You feel very triggered. You feel very upset easily by your parents. Really practice offering yourself this love, this comfort, this care. If you're going home, if you're going to be with family, now is the time to start practicing this so that you can take care of yourself in these moments when you may be more likely to have your younger self sort of rising up and being upset and being triggered, especially if you go home, right? Because so often when we're with our parents, we're sort of pulled back in time into our younger selves. And this dynamic that has been there for so long can just start to get recreated. So take good care of yourself, offer yourself lots of love and compassion. My free ebook that I talk about a lot, it shares 4 practices to connect with your unconditional self-worth. These are going to be practices that will help you as well. So be sure to sign up and receive that. If you haven't already, you can go to dradiagooden.com/free E-book. So it's FR3Es-book. And grab that. And, I just hope that this is helpful for you. I hope this helps you to feel not alone. And I hope it helps you to feel like there is something you can do to heal any wounds that you might have experienced growing up. So as always, thank you for listening. I so encourage you to share this. If you have someone who you feel would benefit from this episode, I would love for you to share it with them. And as always, please leave a review. That helps to provide me with feedback and it helps other people to find the show. And I hope you have a wonderful holiday season. Until next time.